Hi everyone. Welcome to this month's Portals Community Call, February 2024. Great to have you all with us. I'm Jason Gumpert from msdynamicsworld.com. And as always, we are hosted by Nick Hayduk of Engineered Code. And before Nick starts, just a couple of housekeeping items. First, we do welcome your questions today. Look for the questions block in the interface, and Nick always keeps an eye on it. I will as well. We are recording today's event, so if you miss any part of it or want to go back, you will be getting information on how to access that after the session ends. So with that, Nick, I'm going to hand things over to you.
All righty, thank you, Jason, and welcome everyone. Good crowd today. I've heard from a few people that they're excited about today's topic, so yeah, looking forward to covering form metadata today. So let's get going here. So quick intro, if this is the first time you're joining a call, my name is Nicholas Hayduk. That's a picture of me from I think 15 years ago. Yeah, I'm a Microsoft MVP, and I've been working with Power Pages for the last close to 15 years or so. I started my career with a company called ADX Studio, which was the company that originally built Power Pages and was acquired by Microsoft in 2015. If we're not already connected on LinkedIn, please feel free to reach out. Otherwise, if you are interested in more content that we do, you can follow us. You can follow Engineered Code on Twitter. We've got our blog. We just released a new blog post last week, earlier this week, that talked about Fetch XML and the Web API. That's got a few people talking, so that's good. We've got our YouTube channel where we have our weekly tips that we do, all related to Power Pages, as well as at crm.audio, you can find the podcast, the Refresh the Cache podcast that I co-host with George Dubinsky, which we should have a new episode out very shortly that talks about the release notes, which, spoiler alert, is something I'll cover very quickly here as well. But if you want to hear a more in-depth discussion of the Power Platform 2024 Wave 1 release notes as it relates to Power Pages, check out that podcast. George and I think we were close to 30 or 40 minutes talking about the release notes. So those are all the ways you can stay in touch with me if that's how you so choose. If you are wanting to get in touch with me during this call, as Jason mentioned, use that question block. I will do my very best to keep an eye on it. Otherwise, Jose and Jason know full well that they can feel free to interrupt me if I'm ignoring the questions. So, as always, want to just say thank you to Jason and the team at MS Dynamics World for helping me with these calls, getting the word out, helping with the tech, helping moderate everything. Jason has been an invaluable partner since the very beginning of these calls, so glad to continue to work with Jason and MS Dynamics World on these calls for hopefully many, I guess, years. Scary to say, maybe, you know, I think this is year 3 or 4 now, so really appreciate his support on this. All right, agenda. We'll cover our portals news, same agenda as we always have. We'll then get into today's topic, which is form metadata. We'll talk about the time of the next portals community call, and if time allows, there'll be a general Q&A. If you do have any questions related to Power Pages, other portal technologies involving kind of Dataverse, Power Platform, or I guess any other questions you might have, you can throw whatever questions you want. I may or may not answer them. All right, so let's talk about the news. So usually what we do is we look at the Power Pages blog. There has been nothing new since we last gathered here in January. So I guess you could say it's a quiet month on the news front, but that's probably because of this next slide, which is the Power Platform release notes. So the Power Platform 2024 Wave 1 release notes, which essentially covers functionality that you should expect or plan to see in the April to September 2024 timeframe. So if you're not kind of familiar with how the release plans work, Microsoft kind of does 2 of these waves. They have the release wave 1, which is April to September, and then they have the release wave 2, which is October until March. So usually a few months in advance, often for the one that goes out in April, the release notes come out in January, usually kind of near the end of January is when you'll see the release notes for that. And so it's essentially kind of telling you some of the things that you should expect. As with life, there are no guarantees. So just because they're in the release plans doesn't necessarily mean it will happen. Dates can change, things can be changed, things can be removed, things can be added. That's one of the things that, honestly, I'm not sure if I knew that until, maybe the last release wave, where if you keep an eye and you check it back in a couple months, you might see things added to it as well. So it is a living document, but for the most part, I think the track record's pretty good about, if you see it in those in the release plans, there's a good chance that you're going to see it. That's where things are announced as being generally available. Things are announced as, becoming in preview. So those are the things that you should, kind of expect to see over the 6-month time frame. Now, that's not the fullest of everything that changes. That's why we also keep an eye on that Power Pages blog, because they announce new stuff in there as well. So I think it's kind of, they got their list of things that, like, hey, we're kind of committing to do this over the long term, and then whatever else they happen to get in, they'll announce in the Power Pages blog as well. So like I said, in the podcast that I do with George Dubinsky, we did kind of dive into the announcements in more detail. So I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time, but I'll give you kind of a high level overview of essentially the 6 items that were announced in the Power Platform release plan for 2020 or 2024 wave 1. So the first 2 are kind of more around admin, government, security type of thing. So the first one is the ability to disable external authentication providers at a tenant level. So of course, right now, and kind of for always, you could control which authentication providers were configured for a particular site. But if you're working in an organization that wants kind of more global control at a tenant level to say which ones can and can't be used, you will be able to specify which authentication providers are not allowed in your organization at all at a tenant level. So it's a feature that, honestly, I was asked about 3 or 4 years ago by a client, and I was like, well, yeah, that doesn't exist. You just have to trust that the people setting up the site aren't going to enable the things you don't want them to enable. Now that exists as an actual tenant level setting that administrators can set up. The next one that's on the list is the web application firewall is going GA. So we've had the web application firewall. We've also had the content delivery network features of Power Pages that have been there. So the web application firewall is going GA. If you're not familiar, a web application firewall is essentially it's a piece of equipment, or it's a service that sits in front of your Power Pages site and is monitoring the traffic that comes in and is looking for certain things like cross-site scripting attacks, or just kind of the common attacks that you might see coming over the web into your Power Pages site. So it's a great level of protection. It doesn't cost you anything. You basically check a button, it turns it on. It's a really great feature that has been available in preview for the last little while, so that will become generally available. I think really the only reason not to use it is if you need the ability to control more your web application firewall. It is kind of you check a box, it's either on or it's not. You don't have granular controls over which rules it's enforcing or not. So if you need that more granular control, you can set up your own Azure web application firewall that sits in front of your Power Pages site. So that would be a reason not to turn on the out of the box one. But otherwise, it's very unlikely that you're not going to want to turn this on. It's a great feature to have. It's just another layer of protection. Next one on the list here is the ability to set up some virtual tables directly in the studio. So this isn't specifically like a new feature that you couldn't do before. It's just the fact that they've brought in capabilities that you had to do elsewhere, whether it was in Power Apps, Admin Center, or the different places that you could do things. They've just brought those capabilities to set up those virtual tables directly into the Power Pages Design Studio. So yeah, just kind of, they're doing all this work to try and make everything as much as possible done in the Power Pages Studio. And so virtual tables and the setup of I think it's the connection providers can be done in the studio as part of these release plans. The next one here is the one that I am definitely the one most excited about. It wasn't one that I had kind of seen coming, but I love it. And that is enhancements to file upload capabilities. So this is around the actual, the user interface associated with file uploads. So things like drag and drop, just kind of make it a little more modern. Right now, the support for file uploads in Power Pages kind of looks like it's from, I don't know, the 90s or 2000s, or it uses kind of the basic file input. You click the button, it pops open the screen. So this is just going to make that feel a lot more modern. They also talked about, expanding or making the ability or the size of files you could upload via SharePoint larger as well. So a few different enhancements in the file uploads area. And so, yeah, I think that's going to help you with things like using file and image columns, the SharePoint integration, notes, attachments, that sort of thing. So really happy to see that they're making some improvements to the end user's experience. So the users of Power Pages, those people are going to see, basically just more modern experience when it comes to file uploads. And as we talked about last month, where we talked about document management, that was a thing that, file uploading is a very, very common use case. So it's nice to take something, a little bit more forward into the future and just that much more modern experience. What do we have here next? So the last two are essentially some additions to the Power Platform command, excuse me, the Power Platform command line interface. So if you're familiar with the PAC tool, PAC CLI, essentially two kind of areas of improvement there. The one that's very exciting is the ability to create and delete websites using the PAC CLI. So right now, if you want to create a Power Pages website, you have to essentially do it manually. You have to go in, you have to go click, 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 pick your template, and that will initiate, if necessary, the installation of solutions and the installation of the data. And so if your ALM process, if you got a sophisticated ALM process where you can essentially spin up a new environment from scratch, it installs everything, gets all the data, and if you want to set up a test environment, you have it all automated. Power Pages was something that you couldn't do that completely with. There was no automated way to get those solutions in your environment, to get the data set up, to get the website set up. So with this change, via the CLI, you will be able to actually install a Power Pages site into an environment, as well as delete. So that will, if I had to guess, it's probably not going to actually delete the solutions or the data. It'll be similar to the delete operation of the website. So it would just kind of free up the Azure website, the Azure resources associated with your site. But yeah, the ability to do that programmatically will be a nice enhancement. And then finally, again, via the CLI, the ability to run the site checker. So again, if you're doing these kind of automated deployment pipelines, one of the things you can have is you can have the PAC CLI run the site checker. The site checker has dozens of these rules that it evaluates against your Power Pages sites and provide you a bunch of recommendations. And then you could build into your pipelines to say, do you know what, if there's some sort of big warning, big error, or if the site checker finds something, let's raise that first before we deploy it somewhere. So the ability to execute the site checker via CLI, you should expect to see that at some point here between the, in the April to September timeframe. All right. Checking the questions. I don't see any questions about those features. Like I said, if you're interested in more of a deep dive, you can check out the podcast, which should be out shortly. The release notes have a few more details as well, including generally they'll tell you kind of the dates as to when you should expect to see things, whether they're going to be in preview, generally available, those sorts of details. All right, moving on, today's topic. So today we're going to talk about form metadata. So what is form metadata? So it does apply to forms, also known as basic forms, previously known as entity forms. So these things have been renamed a few times over the years. So it does apply to a single forms where it's just a single step, basic forms, entity forms, those are all the same thing. It also applies to multi-step forms, which were previously known as advanced forms, also originally known as web forms. So when I kind of get into showing you how some of these things work, I'm just going to be focusing on a regular form, a basic form. Do know that these same concept applies to the individual steps that make up a multi-step form. And so what do we use form metadata for? We use it to supplement the features available with the model-driven app forms. So if you're familiar with building forms into Power Pages, you know that what you do is you build out a form in Dataverse. You build out a model-driven app form, and then you can take that form and make it available on your Power Pages site. There are certain features or those forms have certain limitations. There's only certain things you can do, and so with form metadata, you can enhance those forms with additional capabilities that don't exist using out-of-the-box model-driven app forms. So I like to think, and this isn't based on any math, this is completely based on gut, but I'd say that there's roughly an 80% overlap between the functionality that exists between a form that you have in a model-driven app and a form that you would have on Power Pages. So you build your model-driven app form, you put it onto Power Pages. 80% of it's just going to kind of work identically. Most of the field types work. There's some exceptions to that. You can't do owner or status reasons, that sort of things. But they've kind of Microsoft has filled the gap there a little bit. For a while, multi-select wasn't supported. It is now. For a while, there was image and file column types that weren't supported. They are now. So for the most part, you put out a form, you do the layout. Power Pages is going to match the layout, the field types that you have on your model-driven app form. Now, when it comes to layout, the one thing you'll want to note is that while you can kind of use a bunch of kind of crazy complex configuration with a bunch of sections and multiple tabs and lots of columns and all that sort of stuff, generally on a Power Pages form, you probably want to keep it a little bit simpler, but in theory, it's going to try and match that up as much as possible. But whatever layout you do define on your model-driven app form, that's what the portal's that's what Power Pages is gonna try and show you. It's also gonna respect things like if you've made a field required. If the field is required on your model-driven app form, it's going to be required on Power Pages. If you put a custom label on that particular field, it's gonna support that. So for the most part, it's not identical, but they're very similar. What you build on your model-driven app form, for the most part, is what you're going to see on your Power Pages form. Now, here's some of the differences. Now, I probably wouldn't argue too much if you said some of these maybe account for more than a 20% difference, but here they are. The big two that people probably still kind of complain the most about is that with a model-driven app form, you've got business rules and you've got business process flows. Both of those do not exist in Power Pages. Define all the business rules that you want, unless they're the server-side ones, they're not going to apply at all on Power Pages. So hiding and showing fields, that sort of stuff, no go on Power Pages using business rules. Same with business process flows. That nice kind of step-by-step process that you can have at the top of a form in a model-driven app. No go on Power Pages. They simply just don't exist there and won't show up if you have one configured. And then in terms of the actual way that you can customize those using JavaScript, model-driven apps have a very specific client-side API that you go through all these methods, and it's like if you want to hide a thing, you never interact with the DOM directly. You go through this client-side API. Whereas with Power Pages, while we don't have business rules and we don't have business process flows, what we do have is this metadata. So these metadata items that I'll be showing you are ways that you can enhance Power Pages forms that supplement or augment the capabilities that you get with model-driven app forms. As well as with Power Pages, while you can use JavaScript, it's more by convention. So we know that the fields on a form are going to match the logical name of the columns, but there's no specific API that we are required to use. It is acceptable to interact directly with the DOM. So that's a little bit about kind of the difference between these two forms and where this metadata comes into play. So you can look at it as back in the day when ADX Studio was first building it out, they said, hey, if we're going to build these for the web, there's some features that we need to give people to build these things that don't exist in model-driven app forms. How do we do that? Well, let's let them define additional metadata that gives them additional capabilities that we just don't have with model-driven app forms. And that's what the metadata is. So for years and years and years, for the last 14 years, essentially, form metadata was something that was done, it was configured in our management app. The new management app for the enhanced data model is called the Power Pages management app, or it used to be called in the standard data models called the Portals management app. So you'd go into there, you would find either the form that you wanted or the multi-form step that you wanted, and form metadata was literally a related table to those, and you could create a bunch of form metadata related to that particular form. The nice thing is now is that many of the kind of simpler features, the ones that are the most commonly used, actually are handled for you directly in the studio. So you may have been using form metadata already and you may not even know it. You might have made some changes to a form in the design studio, and you may not even have to worry about how that actually resulted in form metadata in the back end. So things you can do in the studio include changing labels. That's labels on fields, on tabs, on sections. If you do make a change to a label on a form, that is something that we use form metadata for. If you add a description to certain fields, that's also done there. You can make a field that's not required on the model-driven app form required on a Power Pages form. We do that using form metadata. You can pre-fill data. You can automatically save data in different ways. So one of the things you can do via the studio is the ability to pre-fill data. You could also have enhanced validation. So another strong example of what you can do with form metadata that you can't do out of the box is regular expression validation. So if you have a email field that you want to say, hey, it has to match a certain format, a phone number field that has to match a certain format, you can specify a regular expression that Power Pages will enforce, as well as the ability to customize what those error messages are when that validation fails. So you can customize what does it say if a field that's required isn't filled in? What does it say if the regular expression doesn't validate? All of those things can be controlled directly through form metadata, and all of that list that I just talked about, that can be done without even actually going into the back end, into the management app. That can be all done right from the studio. So let's take a look to see how that actually works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new page here just to kind of start us up from scratch. So I'm going to say golf course form metadata. I can create a page. I'll, I guess, leave it in the navigation, do that. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a form to it. And I'm not going to worry so much about our friend Copilot for now, but I'm going to create a new form. It's going to be based on golf course. And I'm going to use the model-driven app form called information-web. And I'm going to call this golf course form metadata, just to keep it distinct from the rest of the stuff that I have. And on this one, we're going to say it's going to update an existing record, because a lot of these things are kind of best shown by an edit. Submit can display a message. Let's turn off CAPTCHA because no one wants to see me type that, and we can leave attachments off. So I'm going to click here, and you can see this one has a relatively complex form that I've used for a bunch of different demos and trainings and all that sort of stuff. So lots on the form, but here's our form. I'm going to preview it, and we're going to see what it looks like. Now, it's saying the record you're looking for can't be found because I haven't passed in a particular ID on the query string. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to go back and I'm going to grab the ID from here because I know that's the golf course. Go back to here, put that in here, and there we go. So we've got my form here. It's for Augusta National Golf Course. And we've got a whole bunch of different details here in our form. We've got images, files, text, multi-selects, lots of lookups, lots of fun things in here. So I am going to create a copy of this page just because every time I clear the cache, it's going to refresh that page to get rid of my ID for me. So I'm going to be lazy and just create another copy of this page here. What I'm going to do is, it says name here, but maybe for whatever reason, I don't think that's good enough. I'm going to go into here and I'm going to say edit field. So I have a whole bunch of options here. Before I change anything, just to prove to you how this actually does work, I'm going to go over here. I'm going to go over to my portal management app. Now I am using, this is a standard data model still, not enhanced. So it is the the portals management app. I'm going to find the basic form that I've just created. Type in golf. And you can see golf form metadata. That's the one that I just created. And if I go, you'll see here's the tab for basic form metadata. And so far, I just created this form and nothing about the process to create them would have customized any form metadata. So they all exist. There's nothing in this list yet. But we'll quickly see if I go back to my name. Let's just say I want to edit that field. But instead of that, I want to call this golf course name. Done. So now I've overwritten the name of that particular field on this particular form, so that it says golf course name instead of name. I'm going to go over to my basic form information. I'm going to refresh, and you can see what it's done behind the scenes is it's created a metadata record. So I'm just going to open it up, and we'll take a quick peek as to what this looks like. So you can see for this basic form, this is a type of attribute. So we'll go through all these different types here in a second, but the most common one is attribute. We're saying, hey, for one particular column, one particular field on our form, we want to make a change. In this case, we're saying, hey, it's the name field. And what do we want to do about it? We want to change the label. So we're overriding the label by putting it here. And you can see this actually supports, if I had multilingual, I could put different labels here as well. Now, we're going to talk about all the other things we can do here, but just to show you kind of how this works is that when you're editing things in this interface and you edit this form field, what you're doing is you're either creating or modifying a metadata field that exists back in the management app. So let's just say, hey, I want to create a custom error if this is not filled in. Hey, fill in the name, exclamation mark. I can pre-fill in something if I want to. So I can either pre-fill a custom value, today's date, or site visitor profile data. So I can pull in information from the contact. So let's just say I want to pre-fill my first name. Where does that go? First name right there. So let's just say, now pre-fill is probably more applicable in the context of a create record. But again, something I could do here. I'm going to turn that off because it's just going to overwrite my name. But yeah, we can pre-fill it. I can do a custom value. So I could just type in here pre-fill, and that's going to automatically put in that text. We can also do some advanced validation. So we can say, let's set a maximum character limit. So let me put in 50. Now, by default, it's going to enforce the character limit of the field itself. So if this field supported 100 characters, it's not going to let me put in more than 100, but this allows me to restrict that even further. Or I can do a regular expression. So here's an example of a regular expression. So that's good. You can see here, that simple one of setting to 50, that's a regular expression that goes to 50. Let me just copy this one that I was playing with earlier. So I'm going to put in a regular expression here that requires that it have Mr., Mrs., Miss, or Ms in it. It doesn't really make sense in this context, but let's just pretend. So this is going to require that that field have validate to that regular expression, or else it's not going to save. This regular expression here, it uses the old ASP.NET validator scheme, so the regular expression validator. So for the most part, what you want to do here is like the regex that's available within JavaScript, that's the format that you want there, because that will ensure that you have consistency on both client side and server side validation. So I'm just going to click done on this. It's going to add that validation, and I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to take a quick peek as to what that means on my form metadata. So you can see I've still got my label here. You can see further down here, I've got my regular expression, and I've got my validation error message. Hey, fill in the name. I put that in right there. So as I'm editing these things on a per field basis here, it's creating that metadata record in the back end. Like I said, up until about a year ago when they introduced this capabilities to the Design Studio, we always just created these manually back here. So let's take a quick look as to what that does. Just going to refresh that one here. And I'll load that here. So I would expect that if I save this, let's get rid of that for a second. Submit. So you can see, hey, fill in the name. So now I've got my custom error message showing up. So let me fill in OK. Submit. No. See, now it's telling me the golf course name is invalid because it's not matching that regular expression that I had submitted. So again, regular expression is not something that's out of the box on model-driven apps. The ability to override this, the ability to override error message, all those things are not something that comes with model-driven apps. It's something that you get with metadata, form metadata with Power Pages. All right, I see I have a question here from Jim. I have a form metadata configured for a lookup column to be set for the control style to be render lookup as dropdown. I also have a create related record action button to allow adding a record to the related table. However, the newly added records aren't added to the dropdown when the create record dialog is submitted. Is it supported way? Okay, I will get back to that question when we get to some of the stuff on the back end. Okay, so that kind of quickly covers what you can do with the entity or the form metadata that exists in the Design Studio. So again, it does depend on what type of field you have. So if I'm looking at, this is a currency field, there are fewer options here. You can see that we don't have regular expressions on those. So it is kind of the type of the field that is dependent. This is an image, so make it required or not, show a description, but we don't have regular expression. The name one is the text fields kind of have the most with the pre-filling and the validation, that sort of thing. So it is kind of context aware of what type of field you're dealing with. But so that's going to be, the text field is going to have kind of most of what you can do through the Design Studio. So if you're looking to make a field required, if you're looking to change the labels, form metadata in here is going to be super helpful. The biggest thing I see is that people are using JavaScript because I don't think that as many people know about form metadata as they should. I think these changes that are available now in the Design Studio is really going to change that. I think it's pretty obvious now. You can click on this and change things, but before that existed, people probably didn't know that the metadata, you could go into the back end, create the metadata to make some of those changes. So I saw, even on my own team, I saw people using JavaScript to say make a field required that wasn't required in the back end, change the label of something. People were using all these different techniques, basically using pro code techniques when this form metadata exists as a very simple to use low code technique. So I think them adding these capabilities as in the Design Studio will hopefully get the word out that they're there. And then I'm hoping today to get the word out that there's even more capabilities if you go into the back end and see what's possible. So let's do that. Let's go to the back end. Let's maybe just go back over to here for a second. So we've talked about the ones that are available in the studio, the ones that we have, but again, we still have to sometimes go into the management app. Now, I'll let you know that this is a list that's constantly changing. This list is getting shorter all the time. They're adding more features to the front end. I don't know if the last time I went in there, if they had the pre-fill stuff in there. So they are adding to that list. So that's great. I think it'll be a long time before this list is zero and you'll never have to go into the management app, but I think the list will go shorter over time. So in addition to the attribute settings that we looked at, there are more attribute settings that we will look at, as well as the ability to configure notes, timeline, and subgrids. So let's take a look at how that works. So back here. So when we look at a type of attribute, the first thing you'll notice here is control style. So Control style is a way that you can transform the kind of out-of-the-box normal default way that a field is displayed and transform it into a bunch of different ways that you can do it. Now, do know that not all of the options in here apply to all of the different field types. And so while on the front end in the design studio, if you selected an image field, it was kind of aware that, oh, this is an image field, I'm only going to give you these options. It's very easy to misconfigure these. If I pick an attribute here and I pick a control style that doesn't match, I don't think anything's going to break, but it's just not going to apply. So the one that was asked about earlier was the render lookup as dropdown. So, I mean, that's relatively self-explanatory. If you have a lookup on your form, we go back here, to here. If you have a lookup, this is the traditional interface where you say, here's my thing. It kind of mirrors what we have in a model-driven app. I have this thing. I have that option. If I go back here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new basic form metadata. I'm going to say it's attribute. And honestly, I might be able to do this from the front end. That might be one of the options here. Okay, nope, they don't have that one there yet. So if I go back here, I'm going to say that's superintendent. And the only thing I want to do here is say render lookup as dropdown. Save. Now I'm going to kill my cache. Refresh here. So now you can see instead of having that more complex interface, I have a dropdown where I can just simply select my contacts. That is useful if you want to make it simpler. It's also very useful if you are doing any sort of custom JavaScript where you're kind of hiding this, because it's a lot easier to interact with a dropdown than it is to interact with the lookup, which has 3 hidden fields and all that sort of stuff. So it's a lot easier to deal with this dropdown as well. So that's one of the options. That's, again, very specific to, this only makes sense if this attribute is a dropdown, or sorry, is a lookup. There are ways, so if you have an option set or a choice column, instead of it being a, let me see if I can find an example here. Where do we have choice? So let's do golf course type. So you can see this is a drop-down public private. If I change this to golf course type, and I say I want this to be option set as horizontal radio button list, save this, clear my cache. You'll see that I get this option now. So option set as horizontal, option set as vertical radio button list. Those are useful. You'll also see that there's this group whole number as constant sum, group whole number as rank order scale allow ties, group whole number as rank order scale no ties, group whole number as stack rank, multiple choice and multiple choice rank or matrix. You may be asking, like, what are those for? So the thing to know is that those mostly come from the use of web forms, as they used to be known, now known as multi-step forms. One of the things that ADX Studio had in their product was the ability to do surveys with this tool. So the grouping the whole numbers and the multiple choice matrix are often, those are controls that you'd use for surveys. So you can have multiple different columns on your form related in some way. So for example, when you have whole numbers, there's like a constant sum. So you can say, okay, rank, we're going to give you 5 options and we want them all to add up to 100 because we want you to give us the percent that you like each one of these 5 options. So what you do is you'll group all 5 whole, because there'll be 5 separate whole number fields where the user can put in a value, and you can say, if I do that, the constant sum I need is 100. So you can enforce the fact that all 5 numbers will add up to 100. If it doesn't, it won't validate and it won't submit. So that's a very common type of question that you get on a survey. The rank order scale allows you to have, let's say, 5 whole numbers, and you have to give each number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So that allows you to rank all of those ones, either using ties or not using ties, as well as there's also the stack rank as well. So, and same with the multiple choice, that allows you to group multiple fields together as a multiple choice type thing, as well as a matrix, which will give a kind of a 2-column layout. Let me just see if I have an example of one of those. I don't know if I have the multiple choice matrix. Oh yeah, so here's the multiple choice matrix. So you can see here that I've got it laid out in such a way that I've got two of these different things set up, and the way that it's grouped these so that it's just kind of a different layout for them. It's a little, even though because we know each of these have the option of public and private, so it just kind of group these and put them into columns. It's just kind of a nice interface. Again, something that people kind of expect out of a survey tool. So that's what most of these control styles, these first ones, these first 6 here are about that. These 2 are about changing your option set into radio button lists. This one is about changing your lookup into a dropdown. Code component, that's how we get PCF controls on the form. And then single line of text as geolocation lookup validator. I'm not sure how many people have ever used that, but you can turn a line of text into so that if you type in you're expecting that the user types in an address, and if whatever's in that text isn't an address that Bing Maps can validate, it will not validate. Okay, so let me see here. Okay, Jamie. Okay, Jamie answered his own question. So let me go back to, I think Kim had some questions here. So for an attribute or subgrid metadata, what is the code component style used for? Or do you have examples? Yeah, so that's what the code component is for PCF controls. So PCF controls, or code components as they're sometimes called, are used to replace that. So if you go to somewhere like pcf.gallery, you can find these different code components, and the way that you add them to the form here is you say, I want to replace this particular form with a code component. You also do that on the actual form itself, but that's where that code, that style is for. Now, Kim asks, making a field required based on conditions, is that possible with form metadata? That's why they write JavaScript? Absolutely not. So yes, if you want a conditional required, you still need JavaScript for that. But I still see a lot of time people, it's required all the time and they still use JavaScript. Kim also says, I also render a lookup as dropdown if I want to filter the dropdown option values. Yeah, absolutely. So if you know you have a list of, say, 20 or 30 options in a dropdown and you want to make them conditional on some other thing, the lookup interface it's difficult / impossible to control what options show up when you pop open the lookup kind of window. But when it's a dropdown, it's very easy to add or remove options from the dropdown. So certainly that's another place where we convert it to being a dropdown. So okay, let's continue going through some of these other styles. So we talked about the label, essentially just changes to what the label is going to be. The control style, this has the ability, we have some of these things that we can change based on the, if we're choosing multiple choice or constant sum. The group name applies to when you're grouping 3 or 4 controls together. You have to give them all the same group name, so the system knows how to group them together. What we want the constant sum maximum total to be, minimum total. You can also randomize the option set values. Again, this is coming from the survey world where there's an inherent bias in an option being the first one. So you can say, hey, I want to randomize. So every person who takes a survey, they're not just picking whatever's top of the list. If everyone picked at the top list, you'd get kind of a random sample. So the ability to randomize those option sets is there, as well as the ability to apply a CSS class to them. If you want special styling, or if you want to use that CSS class to target some elements in JavaScript, you can do that with the control style here. Pre-populate fields. So we've talked about that one a little bit already. You can tell it to ignore the default value. So if you're using it, if you're doing it for a create, and in Dataverse, it's configured with a default value, you can say on Power Pages, don't do that. I don't want your default value, I want the user to type it. Otherwise, you can say, I want to set it to a value, today's date, or something related to the current user. which is the ones that we looked at. And these work well when the field is on the form. One thing that I see is, I think, very underused, and I'm not sure if people quite value how powerful it is the set value on save. So this is used to, when the form is submitted, it will set the value on a particular column. So you can say, in this case, if I'm talking golf course type, I can say set value on save. Again, I have the options of the current date, the value, or the current, something related to the current portal user. So I could type in, I forget what the option set value is here, but I can say set it to this. The thing that I think people miss on this is that this works even for fields that are not on the form. And in fact, probably only makes sense for fields that are not on the form. So if you're wanting to keep track of, say, which user submitted the form, you can do that by saying you create a lookup on the form that's being submitted to the contact record, and you use this to set it equal to the contact. Or you want to say, what date was this submitted on the portal? Or what date was this last edited on the portal? Because maybe it was edited more recently by a user in a model-driven app, but you want to see, when was this last edited on the portal? You can use this functionality to say, I want to set this date to be the current date on the thing. So again, this does not, the field that you're dealing with here does not have to appear on the form in the portal for it to be able to set the value here. So sometimes you'll set a field that says, hey, this was created from the portal. So you can just kind of hard code a value that says, yeah, what was the source of this? This was created from the portal. You do that here, and you don't have to put that field on the form. What I see often is people, when they want to do that, they add the field to the form, they set the value in JavaScript, and then they hide the field. Well, that's a bit of a, like, in theory, someone who's going into the back end, or someone who knows code could go in there and use JavaScript, or just change the way that field's submitted. When you do it this way, there's no way for a user to manipulate that. We've got some lookup settings. So this is if the field happens to be a lookup, you can set which basic form to use for create. You can add additional instructions or description. So that's the one that we kind of looked at over here. If you go into this, edit field, and you say you want to add a description, you can either have it above, below, or above the label. And you can have additional instructions here. You'll see that it'll put them in there. And then finally, what we got here is validation. So this is where you can put in your regular expression, but you can also control, like, what does the message say when just regular validation fails, the regular expression fails. You could also make this field required, and what the error messages are for the different validations failing. Range validation, geolocation, constant sum, multiple choice, rank order. So those different control styles that we were using, you can use this to change whatever, to make the message whatever you want as part of the validation. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so let me get back to Jim's question from earlier. So he says, I have a form metadata configured for a lookup column to set the control style to render lookup as dropdown. So he's gone into here and says, hey, for my lookup, let's just, for funsies, put that to superintendent. So for that one, I want to render this one as a dropdown. I also have a create related record action button to allow adding a record to the related table. However, the newly added records aren't added to the dropdown when the create related record dialog is submitted. So what, if I'm understanding correctly, if the superintendent is a dropdown and you have another button on the form that creates more records that should appear in here, that's probably not going to get refreshed until you refresh the page. That's probably a bug I would report to Microsoft, but the challenge is that they're not going to necessarily know if that relate updates that. So I suspect that's just that's just the way it works. If you wanted to, I'm trying to think of how you would fix that. You'd have to probably have some JavaScript that kind of tracks the event of that record being created. I'm not sure how you'd know what the ID is. But like once that was submitted, you could maybe do a web API call to get the updated list of options. Sorry, no simple answer on that one. Okay, what do we got? We've got 9 minutes left here. Okay, so that's a quick overview of the attribute thing. You can see there's lots of different things you can do that you can't just do with out-of-the-box forms. Let's take a quick look at, for section and tab, really the options are you can say, hey, for this tab, overwrite the name. For this section, overwrite the name. So if I go back to here, and that is something that you can do in here, we've got a section here. I'm going to go to a new tab here. If I go into this tab, I can say new tab title. So if I do that, if I go back to this, discard my changes, we'll see that I have a new one for tab that overwrites the name. So tab and section, and you'll get used to clicking on the wrong thing there. Don't click on here because that's the basic form. Click somewhere else to open up that, and you can see that it's just setting the label. Okay, go back to new. For metadata. So that covers the tab and the section. We've talked about attribute. So what we have left is notes, subgrid, and timeline. So if I select subgrid, what I'm going to do here is they give you the option for code component, which is to use a PCF controller to override it. Otherwise, when I select my subgrid, what this gives me is essentially the grid configuration I would get if this thing was a list. So a subgrid is just basically like a list. So the ability to have actions based on that grid, on the subgrid, similar to what exists for the list. So the ability to create records in that subgrid, download the associate step, as well as the individual item actions. So be able to go to edit or details pages, deletes, run workflows, create related records, disassociate, activate, deactivate, and some of these options change depending on what table you're doing, as well as advanced settings like error messages, CSS classes, column width styles, a whole lot of options in here. But this is essentially the settings that you get if you're creating a list. So you use entity or basic form metadata to apply those types of options to a subgrid that appears on your form. Kim's asking if the subgrid metadata can be an editable grid. It would have to be via the as a PCF control. In theory, that should be possible, but you'd have to implement it as a PCF control. Jim gives us an update. I've been able to refresh the dropdown via web API on a manual button click, but can't figure out the event to attach to for when the new record dialog is submitted. Yeah, that's going to be the tricky part. There probably isn't a, I don't know off the top of my head. You'd essentially just have to, you could either use like a DOM listener event to like look for the closing of a dialog potentially. I think I have a blog post on handling the close for some of those modals, so that might be worth checking out. All right, so that's subgrid. Again, without getting into all the details of what you can do on a list, that's essentially what it's for. And then finally, let's talk about notes and timeline. So both notes and timeline are used to control how the timeline control on a form is displayed. So you're allowed to have the timeline control exist one time on the form. So you can't, on one particular form, you can either have timeline or notes. You have to pick one or the other. If you pick notes, it's going to create notes or annotations. If you pick timeline, you're going to be creating, it's going to be displaying activities. So if you have timeline, it's going to show activities. If you create a new activity, it's going to be creating something called portal comments. If you use notes, it's creating notes with annotations. Annotations with which can have files and all that sort of stuff. So when you select notes, what you can configure here is, hey, can I create? Can I edit? What are the error messages? Where do we want to have file attachments? What kind of files do we accept? So there's a bunch of settings about what the timeline control looks like. Now you still have to have table permission set up properly, all that sort of stuff. But this allows you to, if you do have the timeline control and you want it to display annotations, this gives you all the settings that you have to control lots of messages. Again, if you go to the advanced settings, lots of messages, whether you can create, whether you can edit, whether you can delete, and then like the settings for the upload. So like how big of files do we accept? What's the error message if they exceed that? All that sort of stuff. And then if you switch this over to timeline, it's a similar thing. It's again allowing you to control the experience that you have when that when that timeline control is displayed. So whether I can create portal comments, file attachments, restricting of file attachments, and then some error messages and labels and all that sort of stuff. So if you do have those controls on your, if you do have the timeline control on your form, you definitely want to be configuring either the timeline or the notes metadata to get that figured out. Kib's asking if I can point to an example of a PCF control editable subgrid. I can't off the top of my head. I know that the example that Microsoft has for the web API is somewhat like an editable grid. I'm trying to think of the Power Pages component. Now, is there a different way to do editable subgrid as it is not an out-of-the-box control in Power Pages? Yeah, like the editable subgrid is, I believe there might be some PCF controls. There might be a PCF control in here that works. Again, when the web API came out, so Power Pages Web API, the sample they provided was a kind of a, yeah, this one here is like an editable grid. So that would be a good starting point. Of course, like depending on what kind of field types you have, like it's not going to be perfect, but this is what that is, was an editable grid. So you can see here that there's like a hover to click on that. And then, so whether that's a PCF control or not, that's like you can implement it as a PCF control by just taking that code, packaging it as an app into a PCF control. All right, what are we at here? 2 minutes. Okay, let me jump back here quickly. We've got our next call will be March 21st, 3 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. I guess we'll have the daylight time switch before then. Again, thank you to Jason and the team at MS Dynamics World. Jason, did I miss any questions? Or we've got, I guess, 2 more minutes here. Does anyone else have any more questions that they want to throw in there? Otherwise, that's our time for today.
I think you caught them all, Nick. We can give it another minute, though, certainly.
Let me just see. Yeah, no, I think I got them all. Yes. All right. I think that's probably good. I don't see any more questions here, Jason. So I think we could probably wrap it up.